Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of Insight. This week Tony is going to make us a Sazerac.
Well, a Sazerac is allegedly the original American cocktail. There's some debate between New Orleans and San Francisco over who had the first, but most will contend that New Orleans invented the Sazerac back in, the 1860s or 70s. So we're going to begin with, I have an atomizer with absinthe in it, and we're going to just give a nice little coating in these coupes. You can, if you don't have an atomizer, you can use a rinse and then dump it out, but this is a little bit more even coating. And then in a stirring glass with ice, we're going to add specifically creole bitters. And we're going to do, I'm going to say maybe 3 dashes per drink, maybe 7. And then I tend to use a little bit less sugar in my cocktails, so I'd say about 1/3 of an ounce per drink of simple syrup. And this is using raw turbinado sugar.
Our favorite.
Yes. And lastly, typically the whiskey is rye whiskey. The brand I use, coincidentally, is Sazerac rye, which is not necessary for a Sazerac cocktail. But I think this is some of the best bang for the buck and incredibly difficult to find in Florida, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've had it in New York lots of times.
Yeah, up in the Northeast, it's much more available and much less expensive.
And it's raining again.
Again,
Is it ever going to stop?
Every video we make.
I feel like Florida is not upholding its end of the bargain at the moment.
Sunshine State. By the way, that's 2 ounces of whiskey per drink. Now we're going to stir for 30 seconds. Then we're going to strain into the coupes. Then we're going to add a twist of lemon. A little bit around the edge. A lot of times I use peels, which is a fatter expression of the fruit, but this is just a little bit more subtle. There we are.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers. Very nice.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have a wonderful program this week. It's the first time this season we're stepping to England, although we have been in the British Isles already once this season with the James Macmillan piece. We begin with Benjamin Britten's Serenade for tenor, horn, and strings. Actually, it's the second on the program, but let's talk about that first. It's really interesting to me. Britten's language is something that has taken me years to get into, but the more I have, the more I really deeply admire it, and I find it more touching than I did when I was younger in school. And his songs have been some of the pieces that have been my gateways for that. The War Requiem was one. Some of his operas, and this is a stunningly beautiful piece set to poetry of multiple English poets. And he has such a remarkable way with connecting words and vocal line in music, but it's totally different than how the Germans do it. So how do you see the way in which he accomplishes that fusion of words and music?
Well, something about his word setting always seems very inevitable. It always sounds like the rhythms of spoken English. So maybe that's got something to do with it. It's an amazing piece. It's this unbelievably fertile period in Britten's life, 1943. So Peter Grimes is a couple of years away. But it's the early days of his relationship with Peter Pears, his partner and collaborator. So there's definitely something about Pears' voice that is informing the way the words are set as well. And of course, Britten is amazing in the way that he's able to take elements that are so familiar to us, like a major triad, and make them sound something unexpected and new. Yes. And there's a great deal of that. The impetus for this piece was a wonderful young horn player called Dennis Brain, whom Britten met in the early 1940s. And he was so captivated by his playing that he immediately began to look for something to write for him.
Yeah.
So writing a piece for tenor and horn was this kind of perfect way of using all the things that he had available to him at the time.
Yeah.
And he takes 6 poems, all English, and puts them together into a cycle that tells a kind of story of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
From early evening, so the first poem, our days grown old, the setting sun, as the sun is setting, all the way to the magisterial Keats sonnet that ends it, that talks about sleep as this way of escaping the trials and tribulations of every day. So we go from early evening to kind of deepest REM at the end. And he writes this cycle of very interesting psychological moods, framed by a unaccompanied movement, a prologue and a postlude for the solo horn using natural harmonics.
Yeah. Which means not using the valves.
Not adjusting the pitches.
Not adjusting, right.
With your fist, so it sounds like sharp and flat.
Right.
The way hunting horns sound when you hear them. So a very interesting set of pieces. This was one of the first pieces of Britten that I ever got to know when I was a kid, and I remember just being so struck. There's this wonderful recording from 1944 of Dennis Brain and Peter Pearce singing it, performing it together. One of the earliest recordings we have of Britten, this scratchy old monophone that is absolutely amazing. But the 2 central movements are the 2 that I find the most powerful. There's an elegy by William Blake, and this is a really interesting theme in Britten's music. The words are, "O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy." And what Britten, the way he sets that, really tells us a lot about where his harmonic language comes from. It begins, "Oh rose," a major third going to a minor third. And of course, this is a very Mahlerian idea. The 6th symphony begins, ends like that. "Oh rose, a flower, something which is so innocent and beautiful, thou art sick." Innocence being corrupted, this theme that would come back again and again in Britten's music. There's always this sense in nearly every piece that he writes of things not quite working. There's a famous Bernstein story or description when he says that the cogs inside Britten's musical language are grinding against each other, that something isn't quite right. And I think that's because he lived with such internal conflict. He lived in a very different time from us, couldn't publicly talk about being gay, and I think it really damaged him. I think it sort of made him mean in certain ways, and that becomes clearer as he gets older. Not here, but the fact that this particular theme of innocence being corrupted is already obsessing, he's already obsessed with it, is really interesting. Then the other movement that I specifically wanted to talk about is a dirge, an anonymous poem from the 15th century. These terrifying old English words, this a night, every night and all, fire and fleet and candlelight, and Christ receive thy soul. And this basically talks about going to purgatory. And if you've been a nice person, you'll get burnt for a while, but then you'll escape. And if you haven't been, the winnies, the devils will prick you to the bare bane. They'll bite through your skin to the bare bone. Terrifying imagery. But Britten, genius as he was, writes a fugue underneath this. I remember the first time that I saw the score, and I was sort of 14 or 15, and I listened to the piece a million times and knew all the words, and I just looked at it and was like, you wrote that, that's a fugue? I mean, you know, the brilliance of Britten, particularly when he was younger, is just so inescapable. The technical wizardry. So this terrifying, gnarly fugue works its way out underneath this scary medieval text. Very much looking forward to seeing how our tenor,
John Matthew Myers.
Thank you. He's brand new since our previous tenor has COVID. Handles some of these pieces, particularly that one, that dirge, because Pearce had this very interesting voice. sort of almost falsetto around a G,
Yeah.
but not. So sort
Right.
of like halfway between full voice and
Yeah.
falsetto. And because Britten wrote so specifically for that voice, it sets a challenge to everybody else who
Yeah.
sings the music.
He writes so much for that specific range, which is basically the flip between the middle portion of the voice and the upper portion of the voice, called the passaggio, and it's really hard to live there. It's one
Yeah.
thing to just navigate it,
Yeah.
going from one part of your comfortable voice to another, but to live there
Yeah.
takes a really special
Yeah.
technique.
And Piers was able to project
Yeah,
in that particular range, which is very difficult to do. So we'll see.
yeah,
But it's the first time we've done it here in Jacksonville together, and of course, one of my reasons for wanting to do it so much was to showcase our wonderful principal horn, Kevin Reed, who's one of the stars in the orchestra.
absolutely.
And I'm excited to hear him play this.
And that, before we move on to the Schumann, that is one other very fascinating point is the way that Britten weaves the horn solo with a tenor, which is not a conventional pairing in most pieces. But the orchestra itself is definitely setting the scene in most of these movements, but the horn, it almost sounds to my ear a little bit extra musical at times. But I mean, do you hear it as sort of being quasi-narrative, or do you hear it more as just sort of counterpoint or descant, or purely melodic interplay with the tenors?
I think it's all those things. I mean, Britten can't help himself from writing lots of horny music. So there's the hymn,
Unintended.
the hymn to Diana, which is really virtuosic.
The War Requiem has movements like this as well.
Yeah, I think he was always inspired by performers, and when he found somebody who could do anything, he wrote, beyond what was possible for the horn at that time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in the letters between Dennis Brain and Britten. Brain, the horn player, never says anything is too difficult until he's had it for weeks and has practiced for weeks. He was so respectful of Britten's talent that a lesser musician would have just said that's impossible. But before he said that, he practiced for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then found that actually it was possible. So that sets the bar very high for everybody else.
For sure.
Yeah.
So what was your inspiration for connecting this to Schumann's Third Symphony for this program? So
Schumann 3 is all about the Rhine, the river, and the area around it, the Rhineland. This, I can't even say Rhineland without getting shivers down my spine because of all the musical associations that it has. The Rhine is this river that flows through Germany, and it's inspired musicians for generations. And anybody who knows Wagner knows how the Ring begins with 10 minutes of E-flat major representing the Rhine as the kind of mystical source of all creation.
And then at the end, engulfing everything again.
Goes back into the Rhine at the end, from whence it came.
Yeah.
So there's something very beautiful about this first depiction in music, specifically of the Rhine. It's a very outdoors piece. I think that was the main connection. It's a very nature piece. And even though the Britten is an intensely inward psychological work, it's also a piece, with hunting horns, we immediately think of the forest and outside. So I just thought there was something sort of nice. It's funny the way you can put these pieces together. You probably wouldn't put them together if it were a program that was longer. But when you've just got two pieces, they speak to each other well.
Right. So this is a little bit later in Schumann's compositional life. And, listening to Schumann, he's definitely and clearly part of that thread of German Romanticism from Beethoven to Mahler. But there's something so different experientially listening to Schumann than there is Mahler or Beethoven or even Brahms. What is so different, and how would you advise somebody listening to Schumann, which it doesn't have the bombastic 3-minute 5/1 coda that Beethoven does, which is so satisfying in some ways. He works things out in such a different way, and I think it can be, for me, a little hard to identify exactly where he's at sometimes.
Well, he's far too impatient to write minutes of 5/1 cadences, 5/1 cadences, because he's always off to the next thing. Like the pieces always seem to rush to their end. He's so impatient to finish the piece. So the Rhenish, this one, you almost want a few more chords at the end. It always feels like it's abrupt. I think this piece in general, the best way to think about it is a set of picture postcards. So Schumann was a good conductor, not a great one, but somehow he still managed to make a living by being a conductor. He was a conductor in Dresden and then in Leipzig, and those were both, as they are today, two of the best orchestras in Germany. Then, towards the end of his life, he won the job of music director in Düsseldorf, which is the only one of those three cities that's on the Rhine. So he and Clara and their 7 children moved to Düsseldorf, to this orchestra that was not nearly as good as he was expecting it to be. It was very difficult. This was an orchestra where the audience would still gamble and eat food during the concerts, and they didn't expect the kind of hallowed silence that was becoming more fashionable in more cosmopolitan cities where Schumann had come from. But one of the first things that he and Clara did when they moved to Düsseldorf was to go and visit Cologne twice, the famous Baroque city on the slopes of the River Rhine itself. And the cathedral, this wonderful cathedral that had begun being built in 11 something, had just been completed when they visited in 1850.
It's actually famous in Schumann's Dichterliebe.
That's right. That's the first time we hear Im Rhein, the Heine poem, you mean? Da-da.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. That's the first time we hear him talking about the Rhine. Yeah. So he writes a set of picture postcards. The first movement is one of the strictest sonata form movements that he ever writes. So it's very classical. And I think if a listener listens to it like they listen to a Beethoven symphony, you know where you are all the time. There's no repeat in the exposition, but other than that, you can tell where you are the whole way through. And a very classical nod to Beethoven, of course, in the key and the tempo.
Yes.
It's E flat major, and it's a big kind of swaggery one in a bar, about 1 beat per second, exactly the same tempo as Eroica, same key. Although entirely different in every way, but definitely a nod to Beethoven in that way. Then the 3 middle movements are the most interesting in terms of the scenery. The second one sounds like water, like we're on the water, on the river. The third movement is a kind of nostalgic memory of something in the past. It's a kind of intermezzo, very romantic, very much the world of his songs. Small things suggested, not explicitly stated. And then the fourth movement is a depiction of the inside of Cologne Cathedral. And originally Schumann had the title A Great Ceremony is Happening, but he got rid of that and just wrote Feierlich, which just means processional or ceremoniously. And this is one of the most spellbinding and really unusual things he ever writes. This is romanticism, but a very romantic view of the past, like the Middle Ages. We have trombones, we can imagine priests or even earlier druids marching along the nave of this cathedral. Very Brucknerian in its time scale. You get that sense in this movement of taking off from Earth and being outside our time frame, of seeing amazing things happening, kind of like you were watching history sped up from far away.
Yeah, really moving to some later romantic ideas fairly early on in the timeline.
That's right. And then the finale always makes me laugh because we've just been in church and everything's been dark and miserable, and then the finale begins as if you're just walking out of church on a bright Sunday morning. Thank God that's over and the rest of the day's free, and it's got this kind of bum bim bum ba, it's got wonderful joyousness. And that movement rushes to a conclusion. It's just kind of, it gets impatient and the piece is over before you know it. Amazing it's only 32 minutes long, even though we have 5 movements.
Right.
I think that Symphony number 2 and number 3, this one and the one that we will play in a month's time or 6 weeks, these are the best of Schumann, the best of his orchestral music. All the problems that plague the other symphonies, the kind of too much orchestration, everything being written too much, it's there, but it's easier to fix it somehow. And the Rhenish is just so attractive and so full of tunes and so much an earworm that it's hard to think of it with anything but great affection.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to these two different, yet sort of similar sound pieces. And looking forward to our two great soloists this week, Kevin Reid and John Matthew Myers. And yeah, so hope to see you all there in Jacoby on Friday or Saturday night. And if you're not able to make it, we'll be streaming on our YouTube page on Friday, and details of how to access that are on our website. So, hope to see you there.
Great.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.